Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Watts. I'm the VP for the Grand River chapter of the OAS. Um, and it's my pleasure tonight to welcome you to this meeting featuring Eric Tincombe. And just before we get underway with Eric's talk, I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. So the Grand River chapter acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our chapter is situated on the Haldeman Tract. That's the land granted to Six Nations. That includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place through research, teaching, learning, and community building, and is centralized within our main body office in Toronto. Yes, so as I mentioned, we have Mr. Eric Tincombe speaking tonight. Eric has, in recent months, been working for the Waterloo Region Museum as part of their Indigenous Landscapes initiative. Prior to this, he worked in CRM archaeology for, I think, about 8 years for Stantec, I think, and Wood as well. And he holds an R license. In 2020, he completed his MA in anthropology at McMaster University under Dr. Aubrey Cannon. And tonight's presentation is based on that research, and it is entitled, I will wait for Eric to put up the title slide because I don't have the title in front of me. But I think it's something like Persistent Places in the Late Archaic, Lower Grand River Valley. Oh, so close.
There
Persistent
it is.
Places in the Late
I
Archaic.
forgot to. Persistent places in the late archaic landscape.
There you go.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, so with that, take it away, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody for coming out today to listen to my talk here. Let me just see if I can get this working. Yeah, there it goes. Okay. Yeah, so kind of my inspiration for doing this kind of research was working in CRM. So like Chris said, I worked in CRM doing field work for about 8 years. And as anybody who's done that knows, a lot of the time the sites that get excavated don't end up getting published. So they end up in sort of like a you know site report hell where they're only accessible to other archaeologists. They're not really being made accessible to the public, and they're not being integrated into our understanding of archaeology. Um, it's not always the case that these sites are particularly attractive to publish on their own. I mean, a lot of them are plow disturbed sort of multi-component sites. So that was one of the problems I identified with the commercial archaeological record. Yeah, that a lot of multi-component plow zone scatters. This is not like a nice lakeshore site or like a stratified riverine site if we had any of those. This is a site that's been all jumbled up and all the different temporal components are mixed together. So you can't really tell if the non-diagnostic artifacts belong to one period or another. So that's one of the difficulties, and that is one of the major reasons why a lot of these sites don't get published beyond just the site reports because you can't say much about them. Another issue is it's difficult to access collections for comparative analysis of artifact assemblages. So maybe if you wanted to do a comparative analysis of 10 or 15 projectile points of a particular style, you might be able to do that. But if you wanted to, get a really large sample, like that's something that you'd think would be an advantage of this kind of archaeology. We have a large sample, but unfortunately, they're not all stored in any kind of centralized way. They stay with the licensee, and the licensee makes arrangements for them to be stored. Maybe some of them are at sustainable archaeology. So a lot of them are in basements, and some of them are lost actually. So actually accessing the collections to do research is not really feasible on a large scale. Um, and like I said, most of the reports are in the gray literature of CRM site reports. These sometimes you can get access to them. Like a lot of them now are available as PDFs on Passportal, like so that's accessible to licensed archaeologists. But even then, some of the older ones are only, they're old scans. They'll have to be scanned, like they're only in hard copy. So if you're requesting them, you kind of just have to ask for, 15 different 15 different publications to be scanned, and they have to look through the records. So it can be difficult doing this kind of research. But there are some advantages to the CRM record. So I kind of tried to design my method of analysis to take advantage of these advantages. But there's a large number of sites. That would be the first thing. I mean, there's tons of sites. Everybody knows hundreds are getting excavated all the time. Um, and a lot of the sites are smaller sites, so they might not be the focus of research. Say if you got funding to do some kind of academic dig, you probably wouldn't choose one of these really small, campsites, especially not these ones that are multi-component. You probably try to select a site where you could get more information and more sort of refined information about one particular time period. But at the same time, these places that are have these multi-component sites. These are the places that were really important in the landscape over the long time scale. So these are the same places, even though they're not really easy to excavate or they're not easy to write about. These are kind of the places that people seem to be returning to again and again uh, throughout all of history. And then besides that, at least the access to the spatial data is pretty good. So I was able to get access to part of the Ontario Archaeological Sites Database, uh, the spatial files, so I could actually see all the site locations. So I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So based on the state of the CRM archaeological record, I kind of identified this concept, like this is something that was originally developed in relation to ancestral Pueblo sites in the Southwest, but persistent places. So a persistent place is just a place that's been used repeatedly during the long-term occupation of a region. Um, and these persistent places are, um, it's a physical location, but it also has to do with sort of natural and cultural features that structure reuse. And these are created over extended periods of time. So I thought this was kind of a good way to look at the CRM record, just because we have a lot of these kind of sites that are multi-component. So my methods were obtaining the subsection of the Ontario Archaeological Sites Database. Um, this is something that's held by the Ministry of Tourism, Culture, and Sport, and it's something that is, it's not normally accessible in the way that I used it to archaeologists. So I had to get sort of a agreement with the ministry to get access to this, and I'll show you what this looks like in a second. But I was actually able to get access to a large spatial database of all the archaeological sites dating to the late Archaic period within the Grand River. And I was able to do sort of spatial analysis of these site locations. And so a lot of the work actually involved cleaning the data. So it wasn't really ready to go when I got access to this database. So I had to remove a lot of sites that didn't have key information, and I kind of had to tweak it a bit. So I did that, and then I carried out something called kernel density estimation, which sounds complicated, but is pretty much a simple heat map. And I'll explain this a bit more later. So I carried this out on each sort of substage and projectile point style dating to the late Archaic, and I tried to identify the areas with the highest density of archaeological materials dating to these successive periods, which I identified as persistent places. And then I investigated these areas with regard to environmental and landscape features, things that might have structured their reuse over a long time scale. I in my master's thesis, I went into a few different avenues with this, but I'm going to focus today on the hypothesis that these places were related to the spawning runs of spring spawning fish. So I'll talk about the late Archaic just a little bit here. So this is a period defined by hunting, gathering, and fishing subsistence, and begins around 3000 BC. That's not really a firm date because I don't think we actually have any radiocarbon dates on the narrow point Archaic from Ontario. So these are dates coming from New York, but around 3000 BC is the date we've got. So besides that, it's divided up into three sort of substages defined by the projectile point styles. So the first one, like I said, is narrow point. Then broad point. These are really sort of distinctive, huge projectile points that anybody who's worked in Ontario archaeology will be familiar with. They're very obvious when you find one. They're large. Some people think maybe these are knives, but I know of one study that was done on use-wear analysis that pretty much proved that they were actually used as projectile points as well, which is interesting. And then The final, I guess the latest period in the late Archaic would be the small point. This is defined by smaller projectile points, even though some of them are not really that small. And the last of these date to around 800 BC. So these are hind points. These points, you can see there in the bottom right, they are very similar to meadowwood points of the early woodland period. And in fact, they're actually found in some of the same contexts. So some of the same burial sites, you'll find both hind uh, and meadowwood points. The only real difference between these, two archaeological cultures is you start to see pottery with meadowwood, but hind is still pre-pottery. So those are pretty firmly dated to the end of the late Archaic, based on their similarity with meadowwood. Um, these other ones, Crawford Knoll in his Ace of Spades, there's probably some overlap between them, but they generally kind of seem to follow this sequence. Adder Orchard there in the middle of the Broad Point is actually earlier than Genesee. Um, so there may be some overlap between these different substages, but generally speaking, they sort of document like a progression of different styles through time. And I chose the late Archaic period as my time period of study here, largely because we're looking at a time period with similar environmental conditions and similar lake levels to today. So I wasn't dealing with a lot of this like underwater lakeshore stuff where everything, probably all the big sites are underwater. And I wasn't dealing with like a radically different environment. So my study area, you might think I should have chosen just the Lower Grand watershed, but the reason I didn't do that is because it gets super narrow towards the mouth of the Grand, and I kind of wanted to get more of a sample along the lakeshore here. So I decided to do 15 kilometers buffer on all sides of the Grand River, um, just as far as the dam in Cambridge. So I didn't really get the Upper Grand, and I did this buffer around parts of the Nith River as well too. This is it encompasses the Lower Grand River watershed and some more, a few other watersheds as well. And of course, this is dealing with mostly the Haldeman Tract here. And like I said, the Ontario Archaeological Sites Database. So this is the permanent database that holds information on all sites. So not just CRM sites, but also, any sites that were found in the 60s or in the 1900s or whatever. All of these are included within the Ontario Archaeological Sites Database that's maintained by the Ministry of Tourism, Culture, and Sport. Um, so I got a subset of this. I couldn't get the whole thing, but I was able to get a subset dealing with the study area there. Um, the level of detail in this database it varies from between the entries. Like a lot of them are just designated as late archaic, and they don't specify the projectile point style or the substage. And the availability of the site reports themselves, it varies. Some of them, it was easy to get a PDF version of the site report. Some of them were available upon request of the ministry, and then other ones were stored as paper copies. They needed to be retrieved and scanned. So I didn't actually attempt to get a hold of every single site report on all the sites in this subsection of the database. I did get a lot of them. I looked through some of the sites in the major areas that I'll talk about here, but yeah, due to time constraints, I just couldn't get a hold of all these things. Um, but once I cleaned the data, once I removed some of the duplicates, once I removed some of the sites that I couldn't find too much information on, I ended up with 299 sites in the study area. And these were ones that had diagnostic materials dating to specific periods within the late Archaic. And they range from this can be single artifact find spots to large multi-component sites. I didn't really differentiate between these different types of sites within my study. The reason for that is even with a larger site, when it's multi-component, if you have a late Archaic component, you can't really always tell. It could just be a find spot. It could just be a projectile point loss. You don't know what proportion of the flake material usually belongs to that late Archaic component. So I kind of treated them all as equal in my analysis, and I used basically the artifact as the unit of analysis rather than a site. And here's an example of the sort of table this is the kind of information I was looking at. This is this is not actually late archaic sites, so these are this is another thing I'm working on, but this is what it kind of looks like to me when I was doing the research. And here's what it looks like on the map. So you can see a lot of sites. Um, and I broke these down by different projectile point styles. So this is pretty interesting. This is late archaic substages in the Grand River area. As you can see, narrow point and broad point are pretty you know, there's a similar number of sites for both of those. Small point sites are much more common, and Crawford Knoll sites are way more common than anything else, which is interesting. I'm not exactly sure why this would be the case, but I know there have been some studies. I think Chris, you did this one um, on comparing late archaic small point projectile points to ethnographic examples to see if, maybe these are bow and arrow projectile points. And I believe the conclusion of that study was that Crawford Knoll projectile points really closely matched to ethnographic examples of lithic bow and arrow points. So Crawford Knoll might be, we might be seeing the introduction of the bow and arrow into Southern Ontario. And maybe this technological change could account for the really, a lot higher number of Crawford Knoll projectile points here. These are, just to be clear, these are components I'm talking about here. So this is not actually a number of sites. This is a number of site components. And like I said, the sites can be multi-component. So, you might have Crawford Knoll component and a Lamoka component, for example, on the same site. So this, if you add these all up, they wouldn't add up to 299 here. So kernel density estimation. I'll try and be brief with this. Try not to bore you too much with this, but kernel density estimation is basically a method of making heat maps. So what I wanted to do was uh, see where the highest concentration of sites was for each time period in the study area. And there were a number of ways I could approach this. So one thing I thought about doing was, looking at the sub watersheds. So looking at like the tributary streams and seeing, okay, which tributary streams have like the highest number of sites. But then the tributary streams, their watersheds are not of an equal size. So a larger watershed probably is going to end up with more sites. I could have divided the area into a grid and just kind of done like a histogram map. But then the grid size really is it's a really, a factor that's influencing the results greatly. So I ended up with kernel density estimation. So if you look at this image here, what kernel density estimation is doing is you're basically placing like a three-dimensional parabolic function on top of each of the data points. So if you imagine each site in the database, uh, putting the sort of function over top of it, and then where these different sorts of functions overlap, you're summing together their values. So when you see this sort of wavy looking map next to the singular one, this is what's happening when you combine these functions together. So um, you're basically creating a heat map, but the influence of each site spreads out to a predetermined radius. And I figured out, this gets pretty technical, but I figured out like an optimum radius for each data set here. So looking at the results with narrow point sites, Normanskill, there just weren't that many sites. So I think the sample was a little bit too small. As you can see here, the site clusters are really diffuse. So that wasn't really super usable. But with the Lamoka sites, it was a little bit better. I was able to identify like a few different areas that had like a higher concentration of Lamoka sites. And Ancaster was really number one there. You can see the most intense red. Number two was in Kitchener, and then Brantford, and then Fisherville. That one's pretty diffuse, but these were the areas of the greatest concentration of Lamoka sites. Interestingly, this is a pretty different distribution compared to the later periods within the late Archaic, which is significant because, looking at this, you might say, well, you're just looking at the intensity of construction or development in Southern Ontario. This is why you're seeing these you know hot spots on the map. Uh, But the fact that there's a different distribution of the hotspots for the narrow point versus the broad point and small point sites seems to indicate otherwise. Unfortunately, there's no way to see which parts of Southern Ontario have actually been surveyed. That would be, that would be a great addition to the Ontario Archaeological Sites Database if we could see, like some spatial representation of where there's been a stage two and where there's been a stage three, like a big polygon showing the area. That would really have made this more scientific, but that type of data does not exist as far as I know. So yeah, looking at a broad point here, as you can see, the distribution is pretty different. Caledonia really is the site of the most intense cluster of broad point sites, both for Adder Orchard and for Genesee points. As you can see, it's a little bit different between the two of them, but both of them have a pretty significant cluster in south of Brantford as well. And then looking at Perkiomen points, these were a little bit more rare in the study area, as you can see, but they're pretty much only found in these two areas. And then when you look at the overall all broad point sites, those two areas just light up once again. And with small point, it's a similar story. So the most intense site cluster for all the small point like different styles was Caledonia, and then second was south of Brantford. So we see these two areas over and over again. Really intense density of sites dating to the late Archaic period. And these are actually pretty restricted areas, as you'll see. Like it's not over a wide area. It's really just kind of, you know, maybe just one little tributary stream where all these sites are located. So looking at all late Archaic sites, you can see here, I combined them all. I carried out kernel density estimation on like the overall data set. And yeah, it's the same story. And maybe this is a better way to look at it. This is just each of the site clusters from each projectile point style circled and then overlaid. And you can see, these areas that are consistently the site of like really intense site clusters. And then I ranked them by intensity. You'll see in the chart here. As you can see, Caledonia is just number one for all of the point styles except for the narrow points. So they seem to have a different kind of distribution. And south of Brantford was pretty commonly the second or third most intense cluster. So these are places that are clearly, important throughout the late Archaic small point and broad point substages. And they're places that seem to be returned to repeatedly, while not at the exact same campsite, but the same area is being revisited over and over again. So looking at the Caledonia cluster, we're looking at 66 sites over a roughly 8 kilometer squared area. And these are mostly on the north side of the river on, all along Seneca Creek. There's a few on the other side of the river, but for the most part, they're in one area. Interestingly, there were a few uncommon late Archaic styles identified by the site reports here. We had like a Susquehanna broad point. These are, sorry, one moment. Yeah, these are pretty uncommon in Ontario. Like it's not like they're unheard of, but they're more commonly found in New York and Pennsylvania. We had an Orient fishtail point. These are like a central New York projectile point, and Harrison stem turkey tail point. These were traded all over the place, but they're pretty common in the Midwest where they were manufactured there. So interestingly, we had all these sort of rare late Archaic projectile point styles found in these site clusters that had really high level of intensity for all the different broad point and small point projectile point styles. These were also made on Onondaga chert, so we're not talking about a exotic chert here. Had to get a little bit creative here. I couldn't show the actual site locations because my agreement with the ministry, I wasn't really supposed to publish the specific site location, so you'll have to just use your imagination here. But this circle is sort of the approximate location. You can see they're all within Seneca Creek. There was a few on the other side of the river there. And then looking at the Brantford site cluster, this was 36 late archaic sites. As you can see, there's a pretty high number of Crawford Knoll sites. And these were sort of distributed more so in two subclusters. So one of them was closer to the Grand, and one of them was more closely associated with Dobany Creek and the surrounding wetlands. And interestingly, one of the sites here, this was AGHB 549, doesn't have like a real name. This is just the border number, but the lithic analyst from I want to say it was ASI. I can't remember uh, which company did this project. I think it was ASI. Um, anyway, the lithic analyst said uh, that they thought the site probably represented a broad point biface cache. So there were 38 bifaces that were identified as broad point bifaces. Um, and these were not found, they weren't found in a single feature or anything like that. The site was plow disturbed, so it kind of gives the impression of biface cache that was disturbed by the plow and spread throughout the field, since there are so many of these like pristine, um, preforms, biface preforms, which is interesting when we're thinking about persistent places, because it seems to imply, intent, maybe an intent to return to the site, or there's a number of reasons why you might have a cache of something like that. It could be a sort of offering, which might indicate, in the same way, special importance to the place. But yeah, it seems to imply maybe like an intent to return to this place, which is that's significant given the other evidence here. So yeah, like I did with the Caledonia cluster, here's the approximate location of the sites. Most of them are right close to the Grand there, sort of on like a you know little bit higher terrace overlooking the Grand, and then we had a large number of them in Dobany Creek as well. So I'll return to my definition here. I think we could say we identified some persistent places here with Caledonia and south of Brantford. Now I want to look at, what is the reason why these places have such a, high intensity of late archaic materials? What might be the kind of environmental features that would restructure this reuse throughout the period? So one thing I was really focused on here, I looked at a few different avenues in my thesis, but uh, this is what I'm going to talk about today mostly. So fish seem to have been pretty significant in the late Archaic. There's been some stable isotope analysis of dog skeleton. This is, I think, was at the Davidson site. This is a broad point occupation of the Davidson site. And this dog was eating a lot of fish. I think there was comparison to like a wild canid, like a wild wolf or something like that. And compared to wild counterparts, it was evidently eating a large amount of fish, probably getting fed by people, or maybe scavenging out of refuse piles. But either way, if we can accept that this dog is an analog for a human diet, seems like fish were pretty important, at least at that site. Um, Besides that, there's a lot of faunal and artifact evidence of fishing in the late Archaic, but this is only really limited to lakeshore sites so far. However, on these lakeshore sites, the spring spawning fish were clearly a focus, particularly walleye and sucker. Um, and this has always kind of been like a conjectural component of the late Archaic, especially small point seasonal round. So this going back at least to the archaeology of Southern Ontario, this has always kind of been thought of as likely or possible, mostly because of comparison to a similar situation in the Western Lake Erie Basin, where uh, there's these late archaic clusters of sites found at major river rapids, on the Maumee River in particular. Um, there's not really too many river rapids in the Southern Grand, but I tried to look at something similar here, going off of this hypothesis. So yeah, looking at Southern Ontario sites with evidence of fishing, they're pretty much only on these lakeshore sites. But this may be an issue of uh, the survival of faunal materials. Um, Looking at species here, you can see, drum were really common. Drum were commonly found on these lakeshore sites, but they're not really a river spawning fish. So they only spawn you're really only going to find them in the lakes. And when they're spawning in the midsummer, this takes place in the lake shoals. They're not going up the rivers. Catfish, those are quite common as well, but those are not a fish you catch a ton of at once. These are probably more opportunistically caught online or using trot lines. Besides that, walleye were particularly common, and these were, they seem to have been the object of mass capture at the Peace Bridge site at the mouth of the Niagara River. So there was really a large amount of walleye bones found there. There were net sinkers found there. I think there was this is a bit of a later time period, but there was a ceramic vessel that clearly contained like a soup or something that was made mostly of walleye, which I thought was interesting. And besides walleye, sucker were really common as well. And these two fish, they spawn in the same like sites of same sort of areas, and they are easy to capture in large numbers when they're spawning. Um, yeah, so this spawning this occurs when the water temperatures reach about 6 or 8 degrees. This is in southern Ontario, March or April, and they're known to spawn in these like sort of shallow, gravelly sections of rivers or at rapids, and they'll spawn in the lake as well. And there are just tons of them when they're spawning. It's easy to catch them in large numbers. And given the fact that the spawning run happens, March, April, this is kind of like a lean time of the year. Um, you're just getting out of the winter. It's pretty unlikely that this sort of large amount of calories being available, this is not something that would have gone unnoticed. And interestingly, walleye are known to spawn in the same places year after year. And this doesn't really seem to be something that they learn socially. This is something like maybe heritable. So to give a couple examples of that, um, they tried to back in the 90s, they tried to stock the Grand River with some walleye from the Thames River. And when they did this, they brought the fry to the Grand River, and they had trouble with this because they just kept going right back to the Thames. So even like the specific river where they're spawning seems to be something that's inherited. So this will come into play in a second here. Yeah, and like I said, sucker, they tend to spawn in the same areas. And sauger, which is another fish that, if you showed me a sucker or if you showed me a sauger and a walleye, it'd be really hard for me to identify which is which. They look really, really similar, and they spawn in the same places sort of right after. And that was another one that was clearly the focus during the late Archaic. Um, yeah, so I obtained this data set from the Ministry of Natural Resources. So this is a data set, uh, it's a spatial data set identifying fish spawning areas. This was created by the ministry, and these areas were observed by M&R employees. And then I sort of narrowed it down to only the fish species that I showed in that previous slide, like showing I tried to look for spawning areas or anything relating to those types of fish that we know were the focus during the late Archaic. Um, and I went through this to make sure I removed anything that had to do with fish restocking, river substrate modification, any kind of modern improvements to the habitat in attempts to improve how fish are doing. And there were kind of four locations within the study area that I identified as relevant here. So a long section of the Grand River, this is from Caledonia to Cayuga. Shallow water, it's gravelly, number of river bars. There was part of Mackenzie Creek was identified as a spawning area. And then there was a pair of river bars. This is like right by the Caledonia Dam, about a kilometer downstream. The dam's probably a factor here, but these river bars are still, these would be attractive walleye spawning habitat in any period, even without the dam. And then there was another area known to anglers as Green Waters. So this is a river oxbow south of Brantford. It's a high quality walleye spawning habitat. And interestingly, just upstream from these, or sorry, yeah, just downstream from this identified walleye spawning habitat is the Porteous site. So that's a Princess Point, beginning of the late woodland period village site. And wouldn't you know it, if you look at the faunal records from the Porteous site, there's a ton of walleye bones in there. So you'll see on this slide I have here, they're labeled as yellow pickerel. Yellow pickerel, there's many names for walleye. They are in fact pickerel. I think I've also seen them referred to as white salmon, which is a weird one. But that's, Stisostedion, that's the old genus name for walleye. Now they're referred to as sander, but that's that fish. So half of the faunal assemblage was actually fish bones, and then the majority of that was walleye and sucker. And like I said, sucker, they spawn in the same areas as walleye. So it seems pretty likely, at least during the late woodland, that you know, this spawning area south of Brantford, uh, it was present as well. So it seems to date back pretty far. And yeah, here's my map just showing these different walleye spawning areas. And yeah, so when I compare that to the late archaic site concentration, you can see um, these sites are, they're kind of located right on these walleye spawns. Um, and can't really see where the Porteous site is there, but it's just upstream from that. Um, So this kind of, it begs the question, was there any, were there walleye bones found on any of these sites, or was there any fishing implements? And no, there weren't. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any reference to walleye bones being found in the faunal assemblages here of these CRM sites. But I don't think, that means these weren't fishing sites. I mean, there was hardly any evidence of, faunal evidence on these sites at all. So even mammal bones, it's a plow disturbed agricultural site. There's not a whole lot of preservation of these sorts of organic materials from the late archaic period. So I don't think the absence of evidence here is um, evidence of absence. I think it's very possible that there's still fishing sites, even despite the fact that we don't have the smoking gun of walleye bones here. Like there wasn't really any bones at all. In fact, if you look at the fishing methods that were used during the late archaic, besides net sinkers, these are all things that don't survive super well, especially in these sort of disturbed environments. So net sinkers is one thing, but a lot of these were, bone harpoons or fixed spears, barbs for these fish lesters, which is really just kind of like a three-pronged spear. There were a couple of copper fish hooks. So it looks like most of the late archaic fishing toolkit was it was made of organic materials. It wouldn't survive anyway. And in fact, one of the historically documented methods for catching spawning walleye in the Great Lakes region, it doesn't require much at all. It requires like a wooden or antler tipped spear. Um, this is something that it's particularly easy to do with walleye because of their eye. It's like a cat's eye. It has like a reflective layer. Um, so if you shine a light on them at night, you can just see all these eyes reflecting back at you. It's really easy to spear them at night, and that's exactly what people have done for a really long time, thousands of years. Um, so here's a Paul Kane painting from 1845. Menominee people fishing the Fox River in Wisconsin. And yeah, they were most likely fishing for walleye here. I think he calls them white salmon actually, but yeah, this is one of the many names for walleye. So you can see how this is a pretty, it doesn't require a ton of technology. I mean, canoes are certainly a pretty sophisticated form of technology, but it doesn't require anything that would really show up in the archaeological records. And just speaking to the long-term importance of fishing sites, a perfect example here is the Michigan fish weirs, which are located between Lake Simcoe and Lake Couchiching. Um, so these actually, the earliest radiocarbon dates coming from these fish weirs dates to the late Archaic, so 3000 BC. These were probably used to catch spring spawning fish like walleye, according to the researchers. And remarkably, these were still in use in the 17th century when Wendat people were, still maintaining them, as documented by Champlain. So as you can see, these types of fishing sites associated with spawning fish, they can take on like a really long-term importance, and they have. So my conclusions here. Yeah, I noticed concentrations of late archaic broad and small point diagnostics around the walleye spawns in the Grand River. These places were clearly repeatedly visited during the late archaic, even though the same exact campsites are not necessarily reused. And from this, I can say I think that the importance of these types of riverine fishing sites is presently understated. Um, and I think we need, this. Hopefully, this shows the advantage of doing this kind of synthesis of CRM data in order to obtain a more holistic understanding of subsistence settlement patterns. Um, we really need to look at these short-term campsites in aggregate and in relation to the landscape rather than as isolated sites. So I know this is kind of by design. So the way that CRM works, I mean, you're working on one site, right? You're writing a site report on a single site. Um, but I think these sites that don't appear to be necessarily immediately, super valuable in terms of our understanding of the different time periods, they can become, more interesting when you look at them in aggregate and you look at them with a landscape focus rather than a site-based focus. Oh, and just for fun, I have one more thing that I was looking at recently. So this is a site, Bunt site. This was excavated, I think in 1995. This was found. It's just south of Cambridge, and it was found during a pipeline replacement done by ASI. Uh, and it's pretty hard to go on with this image right here, but you can see there's a net sinker, and then there's a end scraper that's side notch that was noted by the researchers to be most likely a Brewerton side notch point. Those are Middle Archaic points that immediately predate the Late Archaic period that I'm talking about here. It's kind of hard to say if this is actually a Brewerton point. I was only able to get access to this scanned image from the site report, and it's hard to say for sure, but it's very possible that this was indeed a Middle Archaic riverine fishing site, and I don't think there's ever been any publications about that. Um, and This one's interesting because usually CRM excavations aren't happening this close to the Grand River. Obviously, you don't really want to build too many things that close to the river in the floodplain. But when you do excavate this, like for pipelines, for example, or if you're doing some kind of you know, deeper test pitting or coring, for example, I think you'd find a lot of this kind of thing. I think you'd find like a lot of evidence of riverine fishing. And yeah, I'll open it up to questions here. Also, feel free to email me if you think of a question later, if there's something more involved you want to ask me about. Um, thanks for listening.